Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer, and you may be having some trouble with Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree. This DLC will likely be challenging for many players as the bosses and upgrade system make it significantly more difficult than the base game. If you're struggling, you aren't alone. Many players aren't able to get past the game's first few bosses, and the game's later bosses only increase in difficulty. Luckily for you, I'm going to help you get stronger today with the best builds and game tips to conquer Shadow of the Erdtree. Yep, that's right. Today we've got 5 really powerful builds for you. We've got many different tips on taking some of the challenging bosses. We have a strategy to use for the first boss, the Divine Beast, as well as the Hippo, who people seem to be struggling with as well. Keep in mind this is going to contain some early and mid-game spoilers, and we're going to jump right in with the best game tips. Scattered tree fragments are my first tip. A lot of people think they could take their OP YouTube base game build and crush the DLC easily without even having to upgrade. This is a huge mistake. I've been taking my time so far but took on the game's first boss at 4 upgrades. By the time you get to the mid game, I recommend having around 8 to 10 fragment upgrades. Since the total is around 20, you're meant to be grabbing these along the way. Technically, by exploring, you could easily get 4 to 6 upgrades by the time of your first boss. And that's because you essentially start the DLC with your power down and you have to power up along the way so that your build works the way it's intended. For my second piece of advice, I recommend using summons on your first run. Just because your friend beat it hitless in a weekend with one hand doesn't mean you should compare yourself to other players. This is a mistake constantly made by us when we compare ourselves to others too often. You're at your own pace in your own time, and that is exactly how you should treat Shadow of the Erdtree. If you compare yourself to other players too often, the amount of fun you'll have with the game will be significantly less. It's best to take your time. If you don't have a ton of time to play this weekend or week, play a few hours here and there when you can. Don't rush a great game that's not going anywhere. The feeling when you beat a DLC like this one, or any challenging Souls game, is well worth the wait. This is where summons come in. They're fine to use, especially on your first run. Don't listen to anyone else in this regard. Give Mimic the Blasphemous Blade and Blessings of the Erdtree if you can, maybe even Golden Vow, and he'll work well with you while constantly healing himself and having decent defense. This is an effective strategy for Divine Beast here, who we beat with a post-nerf Blasphemous Blade and Mimic. Use this strat if you're struggling, and I will showcase this exact build and stats later in the video when we go over builds. Keep in mind the Blasphemous Blade is perfect for a Mimic because he can constantly heal his HP back, and even after the nerf, which really just nerfed the knockback and posture damage, wasn't something we really used for the majority of bosses in the game. We didn't use that for the most of the bosses because a lot of them wouldn't take knockback because they were simply too large. So in terms of bosses, the Blasphemous Blade really hasn't been nerfed, and it's still an excellent choice to carry you through DLC, and I honestly cannot recommend it enough. It's great. And this leads us to tip number 3. Bleed is still good. The Hippo fight, which I'm seeing many people have trouble with, can be beaten with an effective bleed build. If you're having trouble dodging any boss's attack, play with the sound off. This will allow you to focus easily and watch the boss themselves without noise. It's an effective strategy many gamers have been using for a long time, and for me it has worked well too. Even putting some headphones on and music can make it less stressful, and sometimes you'll be able to take down bosses like the Hippo quite easily by using this strategy. While Shadow of the Erdtree is a challenge for sure, keep in mind that you could take on that challenge. Be confident in your focus and ability, but also manage your expectations. These games are meant to be a monumental task that we struggle with. Which means going in, you know it's going to be difficult. Let's just remember the first time we played the base game. We'll talk about that again throughout the video, but the first time you played the base game, it was really challenging. And of course, running through Shadow of the Erdtree, especially without knowing any of the boss movesets, it's going to be really hard to take on some of these incredibly tough bosses. And they have really fast movesets. Another thing that I want to mention, another tip here because I have 5 tips for you, but an additional tip that I want to add to this too that you may have noticed in the Hippo footage here is do not summon Mimic at the door. A lot of these bosses tend to hit you immediately upon entering the arena. Yeah, this seems to be specific to the DLC that they end up doing that, so dodge the first couple attacks, then use your summon. Another thing I want to mention is I recommend Mimic over Tiche, and that's because Tiche is more of a glass cannon, and Mimic, especially when using the Blasphemous Blade in the earlier clip, will last longer. And the next tip is explore, and explore some more. This is a really key component here. These games always reward those who explore first and fight later, and the DLC is no different. Explore everywhere you can initially and power up along the way. And we talked about this before, but remember how difficult Elden Ring's base game was on its first run. Really think back to that, how much of a hard time you had with the initial bosses, the Tree Sentinel, etc. And think about the DLC now. It's like starting from the beginning again. Remember when everyone didn't know anything about Elden Ring? And then remember a month or two later how much easier the game was when there was all this stuff on YouTube and we knew where everything was and how to make stuff powerful? It's the same thing with the DLC. We're basically starting from scratch again. So explore, grab those scatter tree fragments, power up along the way, and you're going to be cruising through the DLC in no time. If you do a couple of runs through the game, the second and third run will be a lot easier. My last tip here is before we go into builds, some of the early weapons are very good. The backhanded blades especially are excellent in blood affinity. We're going to show them off later in a build, and we also showed them off on the hippo. And then here, we're also going to show off the great katana too, which you can grab both of these weapons really early, and they're there to help you, and they're very powerful. By the way, keep in mind that defense and attack increase with each fragment. This is why I recommend going for bleed or something like dexterity earlier, as you could attack quickly and get in blood procs as well. This is an easier way to start Shadow of the Erdtree, and I'll have some builds for you here to try in a little bit. We're going to go over my 5 best builds to make the game easier. And it's going to make it a lot more manageable. 3 are going to be builds that you get early in the DLC pretty much without fighting anything. And then 2 are going to be base game builds that you can bring in that are really powerful and can make Shadow of the Erdtree significantly easier. And we'll be starting here soon with our great katana build that could do a lot of bleed buildup, and it's in heavy affinity. You could use heavy, or you could also use keen affinity for this one, as I believe it gets a B in both maxed out, and with the two-handed bonus, heavy in this circumstance might actually be better. And then with blood flame blade, no physical damage reduction and a good amount of bleed. Speaking of which, people ask me about that. Really quickly, I want to mention something. Some things I use in blood affinity if it's quick and gets a lot of bleed buildup, but if you're going for more physical damage, keep in mind, anytime you use blood affinity specifically, there is a physical damage reduction that is directly related to that affinity. It basically gives you more bleed at the cost of physical damage. So when you use Blood Flame Blade, you could use heavy or keen affinity, no physical damage reduction, and still get a reasonable amount of bleed. Let's start with the builds now. I'll show you where to get this one in a minute too. We have the heavy great katana with blood flame blade, of course, and then it has overhead stance. Any seal for buffs, white mask, Melissa's prosthesis, Lord of Blood's exaltation, outer god heirloom, shard of Alexander, thorny tear, faith tear, and of course mimic 2. And what stats would you need for a powerful great katana build? Well, we're going to have 60 vigor, 22 mind, 30 endurance. We have 70 strength, a good amount of strength. We have 20 dexterity with Melissa's prosthesis. We're using the faith tier. That'll get us to 25 faith. We have 13 arcane with the outer god heirloom. And that's just so we could use Blood Flame Blade. You really only need 10. And then, of course, with our faith, we're able to use Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength for our buffs too, to add even more damage. And where do you get the great katana? Well, it's the first lake you're likely to run into right here on the map. You can grab this one really early and start making that build. So for an older build that you could bring in, is jumping bleed is still very effective. With only 8 upgrades, I was able to take on this tough enemy here. We end up fighting a mini boss too, but jumping bleed still works fine. Bleed procs are still very good, and the jump attack and successive attack damage buildup is excellent. Yeah, the amount of damage that you're still going to get with these, and I'm not sure that bleed procs specifically are affected by the upgrade system, so it may actually be one of the better builds to go into DLC with. I know it could be a boring playstyle for some, but keep in mind, you want to learn boss movesets and such first and get a hang of everything before you use anything that's a little bit difficult. The second here, we're going to jump into equipment. By the way, I'm on new games, so I have 1 Bandit Curved Sword, 1 Scavenger Curved Sword. First one's on Occult, second one, the Bandit Curved Sword's in Blood, Seppuku on both. We have any seal for buffs, White Mask Raptor's Black Feathers, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Wing Sword Insignia, Melissa's Prosthesis, Claw Talisman, Thorny Tear, Faith Tear, and then of course you could use Mimic as well if need be. I go through equipment fast. I've been doing that on my channel for a long time. Keep in mind, you can slow down the playback speed, and it makes it a lot easier for some people. A lot of my channel, and I've polled it before, likes when I go over equipment quickly. We have 60 Vigor, 29 Endurance, we have 35 Dexterity, 55 Arcane, 25 Faith, Golden Vow, and Flame Grant Strength. Yeah, basically I try to squeeze in a lot of builds in a good amount of time. Now we have the Blasphemous Blade build from before. Blasphemous Blade, preferably plus 10. We have any seal for buffs. You can check out the armor set. We hit 51 poise. Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, Green Turtle Talisman, Flame Tear, Faith Tear, and of course we use Mimic as well. In that build, by the way, especially if you give him Blessings of the Erdtree, he can get so much HP back between those both that he can stay in the fight for a long time. We have 60 Vigor, 24 Mind, 30 Endurance, 23 Strength, 15 Dexterity. We have 60 Faith. And then we're using Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and we're using Blessings of the Erdtree too. If you can get those two buffs, Blessings of the Erdtree and Golden Vow on Mimic, he can be even stronger, especially with the Blasphemous Blade. And next up, we have the one we used for the Hippo fight. I love these. We have the Blood Backhand Blades, plus 25, of course. We have any seal for buffs, White Mass, hit 51 poise. We have the Shard of Alexander. We have the Melissa's Prosthesis Talisman. We have Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Winged Sword Insignia, Thorny Tear, Faith Tear, and of course we did use Mimic for that fight as well. And then for stats on this build, we have 60 Vigor, we have 20 Mind, 25 Endurance, we have 45 Dexterity, and 45 Arcane. The reason we're hitting 45 is that's the first really good soft cap, and if you're splitting stats, those are solid stats at rune level 150. We're also using Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and Blessings Boon here as well, which you can use on Mimic if you only have 25 Faith. By the way, the Hippo took around 5 tries for me, Divine Beast took 1 with the Summon, and I had 4 upgrades for the first and 6, I think, for the second. And where do you get the backhand blades? You can grab these really early right here on the map. They're excellent, by the way. Highest recommendation of any build so far as Shadow of the Erdtree goes. I absolutely love these. And now I want to talk about Savage Lion's Claw, one of the best Ashes of War that you could also grab early. I'm going to show you where that is. For strength users, this one is excellent. Bosses, enemies, whatever you're fighting, it truly is incredible. The amount of posture damage it can do is awesome. And the animation, the fact that we're getting 2 Lion's Claw in the Ashes of War, it's just ridiculous. The fact that they put this there early, along with the backhand blades, the great katana, some of the best stuff you could find early on in Shadow of the Erdtree to help you. That's meant to be there, and as you power up along the way, these builds are going to get even stronger. Wow, he dropped a lot of items there. I thought that when I was making the clip, I was like, I don't know if he was supposed to drop that many, but he dropped a lot. Let's jump into the Savage Lion's Claw build. We have the Heavy Greatsword with Savage Lion's Claw. We have any seal for buffs. Raptor's Black Feathers, but only for regular jump attacks. Ritual Swords Talisman, Crusade Insignia. We have the Shard of Alexander, Arsenal Charm +1. We have the Spike Crack tier for charged attacks. Faith tier, of course, for buffs. And then for stats on this one, we have 60 Vigor, 22 Mind, 30 Endurance. We have 70 Strength again here on our Strength build, 15 Dexterity, 15 Faith. But once you use the Faith tier, that'll be 25. By the way, that makes my levels add up to 160 when you use the Faith tier. And of course, we're going to be using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. That'll give us a total of 35% more physical damage. And then with Golden Vow too, you get an increase in defense by 15%. So that's really helpful too. And where do you get Savage Lion's Claw? Once again, you can get this from pretty much the start of the game. You don't have to do much here to grab this amazing strength Ash of War. It really is fantastic. Right there past 3-path cross. Not too bad. You can grab that very early. Thanks for watching my top 5 tips and top 5 builds to make Shadow of the Erdtree easier. This should help you along your journey and allow you to beat the DLC at your own pace. Remember, this isn't a race, and if you use summons on your first run, you could always do a second run solo and end up getting even more value for your money. With that said, this DLC is among the best I've played. It truly has been an amazing experience. Be sure to sub, and good luck, fellow Tarnished.